Thanks everyone for joining us today. My name is Chantel Dresner. I'm the Marketing Director at BioSpace. I'll be moderating today's panel, which is Building a Culture of Inclusion, just to make sure that you're in the right spot. Great, so I'm just going to quickly run through some housekeeping notes for today. All our attendee phones are in listen-only mode. However, questions are absolutely welcome. Please submit them via the chat. They will be anonymous to other attendees, so we'll do our best to answer them either throughout the discussion or in the Q&A at the end of the session. If we run out of time, we will try to address them in our post-event communications. So for those of you who are joining us that are not familiar with BioSpace, we are the leading news and career site for the life sciences community. We have over 1 million life science professionals active on our platform every month coming to us for news and job opportunities. And we also produce research reports on recruitment in life sciences, compensation benchmarking, and topics relevant to our industry. And most recently, we have been conducting research and releasing reports as part of our Diversity in Life Sciences content series. And why are we exploring this topic? So we did some research earlier this year, and when we surveyed them, 85% of the life sciences community responded that diversity is an important factor when considering a new employment opportunity. And that was a very big jump from the 68% who thought the same in 2020, so just a couple of years ago. And conversely, we also saw a drop in those who thought that their company was overall committed to diversity and inclusion. When we asked them, only 2/3 agreed that they felt included and respected for who they truly are. People of color were less likely to agree. Black employees specifically were 24% less likely to agree. So it's becoming increasingly critical that organizations are not only signaling their commitment, but also actioning diversity and inclusion values. So we have a really fantastic panel assembled here today. I'm very excited to have them here, and I thank them for their time. We're going to be discussing how organizations like yours can build inclusivity into their workplace culture. I'm going to let them introduce themselves to you. Dominique, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Thank you, Chantel, and hi, everyone. My name is Dominique McSwain, and I am the Director of Equity, Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion, also referred to as EDI at AbbVie. And I directly support our research and development organization, which is about 12,000 of our approximately 50,000 employees at AbbVie. And in this role, I partner with business leaders, human resources, and talent to operationalize our enterprise ED strategy at the functional level. So my role reports into the business and talent group, and our group reports into our chief equity officer. At AbbVie, we're committed to valuing differences and creating an inclusive culture. And that's why this topic is very important to us. And I sincerely appreciate the opportunity to participate in this panel and on this discussion today.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Jennifer Williamson. I am a senior global DEI consultant for Regeneron. Regeneron has recently launched their diversity and inclusion journey and has built their diversity strategy around 3 pillars that result in a better workplace, better science, and a better world. In this position, I am primarily responsible for culture across the organization, as well as supporting our ERGs, and we currently have 7 ERGs and are getting ready to launch 4 more in the coming months. And then I also handle diversity communications for the organization. Prior to that, I ran my own small consultancy where I consulted for CEOs and CHROs in mostly private equity-backed organizations, and help them establish and embed DE&I within their practices. And prior to that, I worked at a company called Sodexo, where I worked with the Chief Diversity Officer there to launch their award-winning DEI strategy. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. Hi, everyone. I'm Marian Gamboa. but you can call me Mar. And I am here as an HR director from Maze Therapeutics. So Maze Therapeutics, we are a biotech company based in the Bay Area, and we have about 114 employees on average. I am the HR director at Maze, but part of my role is to support leadership development, to support our research and translational sciences function, as well as to be the lead for our starting foundational DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy and initiatives. Really excited to be here with you today. Prior to that, I was at Gilead Sciences, and I started out Gilead Sciences consulting in their inclusion and diversity function, and then I transitioned as a global learning lead who was responsible mainly for the whole curriculum for Gilead Global, but also for the DEI aspect of interviewing and hiring training for diversity and inclusion. Prior to that, I was working in the federal government. I was in the Office of Management and Budget at the White House as their chief learning officer, but also what I did with them was I launched their DEI strategy, which had a learning arm to it, but eventually became something that we rolled out across the organization. Before that too, I had a history. I worked in international development, and I was in the Peace Corps in what was formerly called Swaziland. It's now called Eswatini for 2.5 years. Lived without running water, electricity for a while. And what really at the heart of it all is I truly believe my values and my role as a DEI strategist is really having to change hearts in order to change minds.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Marika Sainaman. I'm the head of HR at Intellia Therapeutics. We're a genome editing company based out of Cambridge, Mass. We're just shy of 600, about 570 of us. I do not have a DEI team. I have a wonderful HR team, and many of them take on various roles in helping with the DEI programs, as well as our extremely active employee base. So this is the first year where we've actually launched a formal program, so I'm excited to talk about that and hearing from the other panelists. Thank you.
Hello, this is Queenie Wong. Really glad to be here. I am with the Pfizer group, and I'm on the DEI team at Pfizer. I have two roles at Pfizer. 50% of me is supporting our global sciences organizations to be their DEI strategy advisor. 50% of me is about leading DEI communications for Pfizer. And prior to Pfizer, I was on the DEI leadership team at Verizon. So I have some different experiences with DEI. And one last thing, I am an immigrant. I came here to study many years ago, went back to Asia to work, came back to live as an immigrant. I can share with you because of my experiences when I was a foreign student, I did not feel I belonged. So when I first came back to live as an immigrant, I was trying so hard to cover my identity as an immigrant. And that was extremely exhausting. I couldn't really bring the best of myself. And throughout the years, one thing led to another. I was able to be involved directly in DEI efforts at different companies. And that got me to see the value of DEI and that companies actually want diverse perspectives. They want different people. It's actually a plus. And that was so freeing. So now it's really my commitment to help people understand it doesn't have to be about assimilation. It can be totally different. It's empowering and we're bringing more value. It's a win-win for everyone. That's my story.
Thanks, everyone. Really great to have you here. So let's kick off this conversation then. I'm going to open it up by asking you how you define diversity and what does it actually mean, just for context, to really have a diverse and inclusive culture in the workplace.
I can take that one first, Chantal. So I have two different ways I define diversity. The first one is individually, and the second one is organizationally, how do we define it at Maze. So the first one, I define it by what are some of the factors that I value for my identity. I'm a woman, I am a mother, I am a spouse, I am an immigrant, I am an American, I am an introvert pretending to be an extrovert, I am optimistic. These are some of the dimensions of diversity I define myself by. Now, organizationally, I take that and I look at that and I expand that more about what does that mean? Now, keep in mind, people are uncomfortable with the word diversity. A lot of people are really uncomfortable with it. And that's just not from represented groups, but also from underrepresented groups. And so we have to approach our definition of diversity with that understanding that everyone comes to it from different perspectives. And at Maze, we really define diversity by being able to honor and recognize people's uniqueness and what they bring to the table beyond just the typical dimensions of diversity, beyond just age, sex, race, gender, ethnicity. It's a much broader scope than that. And then inclusion. I want to make sure we talk about inclusion because diversity means nothing without inclusion. And inclusion is really being able to make sure that you are driving a culture so that everyone can bring their true selves, their true authentic selves to the table and be able to feel like they can come to work where they feel like they belong. Everyone wants to feel seen, everyone wants to feel heard. And so we want to make sure we're creating that culture where everyone has that opportunity to do so.
Anyone else have anything that they want to add to that? I think you captured that really well. So all these things that you're talking about, that culture of inclusivity, that feeling of belonging, that are so important to creating that positive environment, which is so essential to be successful as an organization. What steps can you recommend can be actually taken to build that culture of inclusion and to build those values into culture and into structure?
I will jump in. I think there are a few first steps that any company can take when it comes to building out DEI strategy plan and incorporating it into the company culture. So the first is really about having that vision. So we have to know this is what we want and why. For instance, for Pfizer, it's really about we want to be a workplace where people can really bring the whole self to work. And this is truly what our vision is, where we want to be, is how we become an employer of choice. So once you have set that clear vision, then you can start talking about a DEI strategy. Again, for instance, at Pfizer, our strategy is comprised of three columns, three focuses. One is about employees, building an inclusive, we call it colleague experience, so that would cover the entire employee life cycle from attraction to hiring, development, retention, promotion, all of that. How do we make sure DEI is part of the entire experience? Our second pillar is about creating equitable health outcomes, which is highly relevant to a lot of our participants at this webinar today. So how do we make sure DEI really impacts the communities, the patient communities that we serve? And then the third pillar is about transforming society with external partnerships. So that could be about our CSR partnerships. It could be about how we're volunteering, how we're really working with diverse suppliers so we can bring economic inclusion. So once we have the vision, then we build out the strategy. And the third step is about having clear metrics. So I can tell you there are many, many initiatives associated with each of the pillars that I just talked about. And there are clear metrics. How do we measure? So those are important. And then finally, step 4 is about executing and measuring and tracking and optimizing.
Thanks, Quinny. Marika, I know that this is like the first year that Intellia has started putting a DEI framework. As an organization that maybe isn't quite as large as an organization like Pfizer. How have you found the experience of putting that framework into place?
Yeah, you know, I think the first thing that's really, really important is asking your employees, listening to your employees, just sort of knowing what's going on. Culture is not something that's owned by HR. It's not something someone is going to, you know, they're not the values sitting on the wall. It's really what people experience. And so, you know, one of the first things we did is we went out and as part of our survey, we said to people, how are we doing on DEI? Knowing we had no formal corporate program in place. We got 89% of our employees said, we're doing a great job, actually, which we were like, this is nice. You know, but a lot of that came from the fact that we have a cultural ambassador group that's focused on DEI. So it's a group of employees who get together and they host many different types of events, many types of educational events. And I think that really helped us, but really listening to our employees. And, we asked the question, how are we doing? Then we asked the question of what else should we be doing? And from that, we actually built our DEI program. And so in a similar fashion, we have 3 pillars. We start with recruiting and what can we be doing in the hiring process and the interview process and the attraction process. We have an educational pillar. There was a lot of call from the employee base to do unconscious bias training. I also wanted to make sure my own team was educated on this if we were going to start initiatives, if we were going to start doing more in this space. And then a 3rd pillar really around employee engagement and launching some of those ERGs. But most of that really came down to just sitting with people, talking to them, asking the questions in the survey, and then really, listening for what should we be doing? What do people want to be doing? Because the culture is really built by the employees, right? And the other thing I think about is our values as a company. One of our core values is one. And what that means is we love that we've got employees from all walks of life, from all different countries. You are part of the Intellia team once you're here, and that's awesome. And we want to be able to tap into that diversity that has come in. So, if you start anywhere, just start talking to people. Your employees will tell you what the culture is. And, the way I see it is we get to sort of showcase it and give them an opportunity to, expand on those things that they already love doing and that they've already been doing.
I love that message, Marika. We're in the same boat at Maze. This is, we've been working on diversity, but really the first year of strategy and working it into our framework and working it into 3 elements, which what you've touched on, which is people, process, and purpose. So I really heard a purpose that really rings true to me and resonates with me is making sure it's integrated. At Maze, we made sure diversity, equity, inclusion is integrated into our core values statement. Well, we make sure it's integrated. We have leadership competencies, and it's embedded into our leadership competencies that handles the purpose of it all. And all companies I work for, all of our corporate goals have a DEI, specifically called out DEI goal under that. And that's really important structurally because that signals leadership buy-in, leadership engagement, and leadership accountability, which is I would really emphasize, make sure that leaders are also as accountable as everyone else.
And it's good to have that constant reinforcement and that constant reminder of like why you're doing things the way that you're doing, and to really reinforce that message. I often find that, saying it once isn't going to be enough. You kind of have to remind yourself over and over and bring it to the table every single day.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
So
if I can, sorry, I was going
go
to
ahead.
just build a little bit on what my co-panelists have said here, and that accountability piece is so critical, right? And it is so important to have visibility on the progress, make sure that you're sharing, make sure that you have, kind of a solid scorecard that, sets the goals of where you're trying to go, translates your strategy into measurable, actionable, quantifiable impact that you're going to have. And in my prior organization, we actually tied that scorecard to incentives, right? So DEI was just as important as private revenue, profit, DEI, right? Like that, it was there and it was important, and tying it to the incentive really shines a light on helping to make a leader-led diversity program take hold.
Yep, that's a really good point. So on that point of on leadership, so larger organizations, I think, are much more likely to have diversity leaders in place at their organizations. We do have like a survey running out right now at BioSpace that indicates that for smaller organizations, it's typical that maybe like less than 20% have someone whose primary job is actually dedicated to DEI initiatives. So, what valuable actions can you recommend to maybe smaller organizations or organizations that don't already have a diversity leader in place? What can be taken? We're getting a lot of questions about ERGs. We've already touched on it a little bit. Is that something that we can maybe expand on for our listeners?
I will jump in again. All right, I'll share a really quick sidebar. The reason I kept jumping in is there was a big meeting at a prior employer of mine where it was a meeting for women development. After a lot of talks, many speakers, it was Q&A. And again, it's an event for women, but it was a man who raised his hand and asked the first question. It wasn't even a question, it was a comment. From that point on, I promised myself I will always jump in and answer questions. So that's why I'm here answering this question again. Yes, of course, at Pfizer, we have our chief DEI officer, but think of Pfizer, it's a huge company, and there are many, many different teams who may or may not have a dedicated DEI person doing DEI work. So I think this question is still relevant. So typically how we go about doing DEI work is really around three things. How do you source talent? How do you grow talent? And how do you engage your people? So around these three pillars, using the word again, this is how people who are passionate about DEI can start putting together your plan. And of course, if you have the data that will really let you see where the gaps are, whether you're listening to your employees from the survey results, or if you actually see the diversity data, then you can really focus your efforts around the gaps. And talking about employee resource groups, at Pfizer, we call them colleague resource groups. Whether at Pfizer or at my previous employees, I think a good strategy is to have an executive sponsor. So find a very, very, very senior person to sponsor, to be the real champion of that particular employee resource group. And that sponsor may not even be part of it's not part of that affinity for that employee resource group. And sometimes that's even better because now we have a strong ally for that community. And that community can also educate the senior leader on things highly relevant and important to the community. So typically for employee resource groups, they do a few things. One, a lot of times they partner with the talent organization to help attract, recruit diverse talent. They may go to diversity events with the talent team. So that's one common thing that employee resource groups do. They will also provide opportunities for development or mentorship among their members. And we all have seen stats where people of color or women, they really benefit from sponsorship and mentorship. A lot of times these employee resource groups also act as a sounding board. They create ideas to help drive the business. So it's not just about people of the same affinity getting together, creating that bond. It's about that, but it's also about them unleashing that full potential, and help drive the business. And finally, it's also about how these employee resource groups can help build the company's DI brand, whether via their personal social handles, talk about the work they do, or actually go to events and be ambassadors for the company. So those are some quick tips.
Thanks, Quinny. I actually had a question come in, and this is maybe good to just kind of talk about in general. What types of ERG group, like what type of employee resource groups are sort of out there? Jennifer, someone had asked, you mentioned that there are 7, you're getting ready to launch 4 more soon. I'm curious, and I'm sure other people are curious, what types of groups are sort of out there, if they're looking for inspiration or ideas, or just to see examples of what that can actually look like in practice.
Yep. So we currently have Juntos, which is our Latinx ERG. We have our Black ERG. We have our LGBTQ plus ERG, Asian Pacific Islander ERG, South Asian plus ERG. Who am I missing here? Our women's ERG, and I am missing one more. It will come to me. It'll come to me. Hang on, I got it right here. Right. Yeah, RISE, RISE, which is focused on mental health. So those are the ones that are currently existing. The new ones that we're getting ready to launch are very interesting. So the first, people with disabilities and inclusive of neurodiversity is part of that group. So that one is getting ready to launch in October. We're working on a veterans group, which will launch sometime November. We're also working on a people living with cancer group. And this is one that's, not only going to be support for the employees within the organization, but they're also looking at how to help patients and how to help others, right, with kind of this cost of survivorship model and everything else. So it's really bridging between just employee resource group into business resource group. We're getting ready to launch a parents group. There's been some inquiry about that. And again, within that, I think we'll have multiple kind of chapters, whether you're parenting, you're a single parent, whether you're parenting toddlers versus teenagers versus tweens. It's, it all has its challenges, and you can use a support group there. And then the other one is MENA, so Middle Eastern, Northern Africa. So those are some of the groups that we're getting ready to launch. And, I can see a time where, as we get more momentum with these groups, smaller groups perhaps spinning off of the larger groups and becoming their own ERG. But those are some of the ERGs that we have.
And I'm just curious as well, like, do those groups form with like employees initially as the ones advocating for the group formation?
They all are formed organically. So it's not like we go out and say, oh, we need this, right? These are all requests of employees coming to, before the DEI office was established, the HR team, and now they come to me and say, okay, we're thinking about this. So yeah, and then we have a process, we have templates for, here's how you create your charter, here's how you create your mission statement, here's how you create your annual business plan, here's how you build your budget, so it's all very organic.
And we're having some more questions coming in as well that I think are very much a part of this topic. Should DEI sit within HR? So, maybe even for smaller organizations who don't have HR yet, or are like still working towards that, where does that effort really start? Dominique, you had mentioned something to me earlier about leadership being everywhere and enabling existing leaders. So I think that's actually something that's really pertinent to that question as well.
Yes, thanks, Chantel. And as we were talking about when a leader is not in place, and I agree with Queenie on the comments of just really enabling existing leaders to better understand differences and needs of their employees. So ensuring that we have that understanding of employees when we don't have a leader. But when there is a diversity team in place, at AbbVie, our diversity group reports directly through human resources, and it allows us to, create an aligned people strategy and ensure that we have the resources in place, the alignment to really deliver those valuable actions for our employees. So within our organization, it is a function that sits and is aligned directly to human resources.
Thanks, Dominique. So when we're talking about HR processes, something else that we can discuss is sort of bias and how to debias HR processes and fair hiring processes. When we surveyed them, that was the #1 thing that respondents said they thought really demonstrated commitment to DEI was having a fair hiring process. So Jennifer, can you talk to us a little bit about, how you, when you looked at Regeneron, for example, how you debias your HR processes? And Marika, you had also talked some things about what Intelia did when they were looking at that framework, and expand on those things a little bit.
Sure, I'll share a little bit of my prior experience because Regeneron is in the startup phase of all of this here, but in my prior work, first and foremost, it starts with, okay, when you are recruiting, who's recruiting, right? Who's showing up on campus? Does it reflect the diversity that you're looking to hire? So that's where true partnership with your ERGs comes into play in terms of making sure you're presenting kind of a very diverse company when you're out there trying to recruit. The other things that we've done in the past is, make sure that you're requiring a diverse slate of candidates. right? So in my former life, you could not hire, the recruiter could not present the slate to the hiring manager unless there was at least one woman and at least one person of color on that slate, and preferably two, right? Because you have greater success when there's two or more diverse candidates on the slate, right? So that was very important. So that, led to some very intentional recruiting and making sure that we were casting a very wide net and going to a broad array of places to recruit. The other thing that we did was require consistent behavioral interviews. And the interviews were panel interviews. So at least two people, again, preferably three, made up that panel. You asked the same questions of every single candidate. You did the interview the same way. So if you were conducting the interviews in person, every interview had to be conducted in person. If you were conducting the interview online, every interview had to be conducted online, even if that person may have been in the same building, right? So we tried to be extremely consistent there. And then, the following piece that we had was, following the panel interviews, there was a scoring metric that went through to say, okay, did this person exhibit this competency? There was a lot of discussion on did they not? You came to a final conclusion on the candidate. And then the last piece of that was a review panel, right? So there was another group that looked at everything, right? Looked at the slate, looked at the interview notes, looked at the scoring to make sure the whole process had been followed before an offer could be extended. So those are some, you kind of want to introduce friction into the system, right? And our hiring managers would complain. It's like, oh, this is taking so long. This is, and it's like, all right, this is why we're doing this, is to bring in, and attract a diverse slate of candidates. So that's what I would say as far as my experience with recruitment.
So Chantel, I actually have a point of view on this one as well. So in terms of, demonstrating that diversity and inclusion commitments, I want to share, at AbbVie, our EED&I vision is that every employee can say, I belong, I'm accepted as myself, I am inspired, I'm engaged to go that extra mile, and I am not the only one. So that means I see myself in colleagues and my leaders. And so as part of our AbbVie talent acquisition strategy, we launched inclusive recruitment education. And this education is a way to continue to support our people leaders as they are making hiring decisions. And during this program, people leaders are equipped with shared expectations for inclusive recruitment and with guidance on really how to grow the employee workforce representation. So we also strive at AbbVie to ensure that every employee is aware of and has access to opportunities for learning, growth, and advancement. One of the programs that we have is an executive diversity mentoring program, which I have an opportunity to lead within the organization. And this program allows diverse employees to be paired with senior leaders across the organization, senior executives, for one-on-one mentoring over a 10-month period of time. So this program within the mentorship really accelerates the professional growth of our diverse workforce. And in the last year, we've seen a 300% increase in participation for this program. So simply put, we aim to leverage talent attraction and talent management to really broaden the workforce representation of the diversity of the patients that we serve. So I just wanted to highlight that and add that comment around, the talent acquisition and talent management strategy.
Thanks, Dominique. Marika, I know that you had some really interesting things that were like even smaller changes that Intelia made. Can you talk to us a little bit about that as well?
Sure. I think there's a lot you can do in this space, even as a small organization. And for me, the first thing is being okay with questioning your own practices. Have I been doing the right thing this whole time, or are there things I should be doing differently? One of the first things we did is ask our recruiting team to go get a DEI certification. Like, go make sure that you yourself, you know, are skilled up to have conversations with hiring managers around what sort of talent do we need to bring in to complement your team, right? Whether it's ethnic diversity, whether it's gender, whether it's education, regardless of which element you're looking at, but to be able to have that conversation. One of the very first things we did is I said, I am not signing a recruiting contract unless I see a line in there that says the slate must be diverse. I've literally sent contracts back to my recruiting team until we all got in the habit of making sure that that was happening and really being able to see that. I have someone on my talent acquisition team who's particularly passionate about this. She went out, you know, presented to me a couple of days ago. She found a host of organizations where she was like, here are places we're not advertising, we're not talking to. We can build some partnerships with them. That's another wonderful way to do it. We have an ongoing relationship with UNCF where we have sponsored their internship program. We've done a fundraiser where we've provided for scholarships for underrepresented minorities in STEM. There's lots of things you can do, even as a small organization, looking at your interview panels. Are they diverse? Looking at your job descriptions and the language in those job descriptions. So, you know, this is one of those things where you actually don't need a ton of money and a huge amount of resources. You just need, I think, a little bit of humility to say, are we doing the right things, and go back. And there's a lot that you can do and a lot of practices you can put in place from other organizations.
So I'm hearing a lot about, you know, looking at who makes up teams, et cetera. You know, Jennifer, you had mentioned like tracking and optimizing and building from there. And we are getting some questions around, you know, data. And when it comes to actually keeping track of these things, and, you know, obviously the more you scale and the more you grow, that gets increasingly difficult to manage. You know, you can't just like take a little peek around the office to see who you're sitting next to kind of get a feel for it. You need to start being more methodical. So what, you know, in terms of collecting data and using that to track, what do you collect? What's appropriate to collect? How do you actually use that data to have a positive impact on your organization?
Well, I guess I'll jump in and start. And I see that, Queenie, you have the self-ID background. We just finished our self-ID campaign here at Regeneron, and it'll be ongoing. But I think that's kind of the first piece with data, right, is to help people understand and encourage people to go in and self-ID, right? And you can do it voluntarily, right? You can, and that's how we do it here at Regeneron, is people voluntarily self-ID. It's not forced self-ID to get through the, you know, the system to get on the payroll. It's voluntary. So the first piece is to make sure you've got kind of, you know, a level of comfort with the number of folks, the percentage of folks that have self-ID'd, so that as you're running numbers and you're doing things, you know, that you've got a good grip on how much of that workforce does that really represent for you. I think the other things in terms of data, you know, once you have the self-identification information there, then you can start to parse it out and, you know, look at it from, okay, what do my hires look like? What do my promotions look like? What does my retention look like? And parse that out, you know, by different groups, right? Underrepresented groups, to see if they are, you know, where's the broken rung, right? Where are they not advancing, and what can we do to help with that? The other thing that we also look at is through our employee experience or an employee engagement survey, we also have within that an inclusion index, right? That we can then look at, again, and parse that data by different underrepresented groups to see if our employees are all having the same experience. So those are some of the things that, you know, we're tracking and we're looking at now, and using that information then to inform, okay, where do we need to go next, right? Where do we have significant underrepresentation, or, you know, a significantly lower score as it relates to the employee experience? What groups and where can we, you know, do some intervention, some training, some programming to help turn that around?
And I can add to that. Yeah, we do very similar things at Pfizer. We have dashboards that we can look at. It's the same things that Jennifer was just talking about, we always look at the diversity data, the makeup, the promotion, even the talent acquisition piece, the sources. Where are we getting what types of candidates from what sources? Why aren't we getting more diverse candidates from certain sources? Is it the jobs description? For instance, we can also look at the hiring process from application to phone interview, to manager interview, to offer, all the whole funnel. For instance, why for certain roles, why are women falling out throughout the funnel, or different diverse groups? So we can look at all the data and try to explore why. Of course, we also look at attrition data and try to figure out, oh, for this pocket of organization, there are more certain groups of people who are having a higher turnover rate. What's going on? Is it inclusion? What is it? So we look at all of that. We also look at inclusion index, and we also try to look at specific answers to certain questions that we make up. What goes into the inclusion index, and figure out, hey, compared to last year, what happened? Are we doing better, doing worse compared to the rest of the organization? Let's look at a heat map of the different leaders under a senior leader. Do some leaders need more work, or some leaders are doing really well? Can they share best practices? So we can look at all of the data, but I think most important of all, as the DEI person or as the HR person, we have access to the data. We need to find time to meet with the business leader and the leadership team. When they see the data, their whole perspective changes, and we can all commit to an action plan.
Mar, I want to give you the opportunity to jump in, just as having a different perspective at Maze, obviously a smaller organization, and maybe having a smaller data set or a smaller pool, for example, to draw on your experience. Something that you had mentioned as a smaller organization, some things that work well for larger companies might not necessarily work well for a smaller company. And you had mentioned that what you had really started doing was starting to be really targeted and really intentional about what you are doing at Maze. Can you speak a little to how you maybe put those practices into play if you don't necessarily have that large pool of data, or you don't necessarily have those resources in place to kind of create these larger things to draw from?
Yeah, definitely. For example, right now, looking at what activities are really going to be meaningful for individuals. So I heard a lot of great practices that are out here, like diverse hiring panels. There's some practices that are really effective for larger organizations, such as blind resumes. But for a smaller organization, I see this as an opportunity to really lean on people to make sure that diversity is really part of the air that they breathe, as my supervisor would say, that it is part of every practice that they have, even when they're looking at hiring. What are they looking at each job description, and are they seeing, is it targeted to the specific communities and population that they want to recruit from, right? Looking at some of our research targets and saying, where are the patients, what communities do our patients come from, and how do we make sure that we are sourcing from communities that we can have meaningful connections to, and then eventually create from those connections, be able to create a pipeline of potential people who are already interested in the work that Maze is doing. It's getting the word out there. It's forging those connections. I'm a big fan of creating partnerships from the very beginning, working with nonprofits, working with HBCUs, working with several universities who have a diverse candidate pool and can offer a diverse candidate pool in order to increase just the interest and the, getting us to a place when, if we grow, we want to be able to have a network of people that we can really tap into, not just when we need them, but actually creating this community from the very beginning. And I want to speak to ERGs, because we don't have ERGs at Maze yet, but that was very intentional. We have 114 people. We want to make sure it's meaningful activities. And with the ERGs, it becomes a box ticking exercise with the population are small. And what we do is we integrate that into everything we do with a team fun event, which is an employee-led events team that makes sure that they integrate diversity activities. And then we are lucky to have a CEO who is a champion of diversity, and he sends out communications for Heritage Months. He sends out, a very good communications, education, self-awareness, self-education. We also have, pop-up book clubs. We have coffee hours, the LGBTQ plus coffee hours, things that really signal that this matters to us, and it happens regularly. It happens almost on a monthly basis.
Right, that's great to hear. So I want to touch on something that we found in our surveys, and we can touch on surveys again a little bit later, especially as it relates to employee engagement. But one of the things that we discovered when we were doing our research is that there is a certain level of a resistance to the idea of diversity. Someone mentioned that, even just the word diversity can raise a lot of feelings in people, different feelings, obviously. So as leaders, how do you address that tension, and how do you really communicate the value of DEI initiatives and overcome those objections, which we know will probably exist in all organizations of all sizes? How do you overcome that, and how do you communicate that value?
Yeah, I can jump in on that one, Chantel. So I would say at AbbVie, the ED strategy and in its implementation are driven and overseen by our CEO, our Chief Equity Officer, Ray Livingston, and the executive leadership team who sets those goals. So it goes back to what was just said about, starting with that leadership support. And then we also have really every function that has goals around DEI and functional councils to help drive that work as well. So really, ensuring that leaders understand the commitment and cascade and communicate that commitment in and outside of the organization. We've held also employee voice listening sessions, as it was mentioned earlier, about hearing and understanding from employees. So we've held those sessions to understand what's on the hearts and minds of our employees, and we've prioritized based on what we've heard. One example that has come out of the employee voice listening sessions, and something that we've did to amplify our ED&I efforts, is creating a differential development program focused on the journey of people of color. So in summary, I would say having that, commitment from top leadership, cascading that message down, hearing from those employees, and then taking the action that's needed, whether it's a program or a practice or something that needs to be done in terms of, bringing in additional representation, additional efforts to grow representation. But that for us at AbbVie, that CEO commitment has been very important.
If I can add to that, so commitment is great. And we also want to look at the why and the data. So I'll give you two examples. As I shared, I also handle DEI communications. So I do see and have to respond to employee inquiries or complaints. So two common comments we get, whether at Pfizer or other employees I've worked for, one would be, why are we giving all these programs like Dominique was talking about? Why do we have special programs for people of color or women? That's not inclusive of all. So how do we address that? Typically, we would really explain to the employee, look at the data. The data shows we are lagging in terms of women or people of color. That's why we need to do better. We need to find more talent. We need to grow our diverse talent. So it's really going back to the data to show them this is why. Plus, there are actually all kinds of development opportunities that are available to this employee, to everybody. So we need to point that out. So that's one. Another example is about self-ID in my background. So we would get questions like, why do we care if the person sitting next to me, what ethnicity this person is from, what gender, whether they're gay, whether they have a disability? Why do we care? We come to work, we come to put in our very best. That's what matters. And we would totally agree with the employee. Yes, we want to be the best that we can be and contribute the best. That's why we need to understand the makeup of the organization, that we need to collect data so we can see where the gaps are. For instance, if there are employees who share they have disabilities, then we know we need to maybe adjust how we're supporting these employees so they can also be at their best and contribute. So we always go back to the data and the why.
I could add one other dimension to it. You know, I think sometimes because DEI often sits in HR, it's seen as an HR thing, right? And my hope is that we shepherd something, we don't own DEI, right? And by that, I mean, this is something that affects everyone in your organization. One of the other things that I think can be very powerful is having your own employees share their stories. We've had a couple of panels where some, you know, pretty interesting things were shared. Examples of harassment, you know, things that nobody would guess was taking place in this sort of environment. That can be really eye-opening. And sometimes, particularly in smaller orgs, right? It's like, you know, I'd love to have the people to be crunching data and be looking at this, but sometimes that's just not at your disposal. And sometimes the stuff that is more effective is giving people that means and the place to be able to share those stories. And when people hear from their peers and their friends that like, oh my God, that's not just something I read about in the news, that's something that like someone near and dear to me has experienced, people lean in a little bit more and then they want to learn more and they sort of learn from each other. It's another way, you know, to just create those forums where people can actually share those stories can actually be a really, really powerful thing for people.
Yeah, and if I can just add to that, Marika, that was one of the points that I was going to make is when you can create, you know, kind of those moments of discomfort and disruption, right, where people get to learn from somebody else's lived experience that might not have been their own. That I think truly helps to move people along. And you know, there's ways to be intentional. Like I love the idea of having panels where employees can share their stories. And other ways that happens is through things like, okay, you know, executive sponsorship for the ERGs, right? When you get an executive that may be a Caucasian male that is an executive sponsor for the Black ERG, and they're hearing that lived experience from the members, and it may be something they've never interacted with, that is discomforting, that's disruptive, and that's how people learn, right? That's how they grow. With mentoring, being intentional about cross-cultural, cross-gender mentor-mentee relationships, right? So you're giving the mentor as much of an opportunity to learn as you're giving the mentee. Wherever you can kind of expand, you know, kind of that social network of individuals, that helps to bring them along in the journey. And then the other thing in terms of overcoming objection, I think is, you know, having a solid business case, right? Like starting with a solid business case for why this is important to the organization. I think will help the naysayers as well, right? You know, we get it. We have kind human hearts, right? We get it, but there's some people that's not what they're about. It's got to be the business. So having the solid business case is very important. You know, for us, you know, science, if you don't have diversity, you're not going to have good science, right? We're all about leading with science. You need that diversity of thought. You need that diversity of experience to be able to challenge and come up with better science. And then also, you know, kind of like weighing into whatever external research that might be out there, whether it's studies through McKinsey or other organizations, the work that you do, Chantal, you know, to show here's what external organizations are doing. That helps. And even, you know, sometimes your own internal research helps as well. And in my former organization, you know, we did an intensive study looking at all of our operations, and we found where we had gender balanced teams, they actually performed better as a team. They had better safety scores, they had better profitability, they had better client retention, all of that. So I think those are just some additional ways to help overcome, you know, objections.
So, oh, sorry, go ahead, Mar.
I'd like to build on that as well. And I just want to I just share an experience of where, sharing experiences and sharing people's stories is really key to bringing people along to valuing diversity. In my previous, when I worked in the government and I worked at the budget office, the White House, we had to create something called diversity dialogues, which are monthly structured dialogues that have activities. And then at the end, it's about then talking about and debriefing and talking about what types of experiences does this bring out for you. And it allowed a space for people to really, almost a safe space for people to bring their experiences to the table. And this was something already in the works as part of our strategy. But as a government employee, where we are told to be neutral the entire time, you have to leave your politics at the door, you have to leave all your beliefs at home. There was a time where I worked in government where people could no longer do that, and really reached its boiling point during the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. And one of our main leaders, our political appointee leaders, was in the news during that time. And the organization no longer felt like a safe space for them anymore. So what did we do? We had ERGs there. We worked with ERGs, we worked with Interfaith ERG, we worked with our Pride ERG, we worked with several ERGs that we had there to bring our political leaders in the same room in these diversity dialogues as willing representatives. We prepped them and they were willing to talk about their experiences as well as employees' experiences. And it was a really effective dialogue that brought our leadership to the conclusion that at the end of the day, it's not about these polarizing views. It's about really coming together as human beings, because that's what really valuing diversity and inclusion is about. It's about valuing your colleagues as human beings who have multiple dimensions that make them who they are, and it's bringing them together towards a common goal in order to make sure that the organization is running and running well.
Thanks, Mar. So we've tried to answer the questions that have come up in the Q&A in the chat, sort of as they've come up. I have tried to include them where we can. I apologize for any ones that we missed. We will try to include some answers in the follow-up, but BioSpace will be publishing some follow-ups. We'll be doing some of our own digging and reaching out to our wonderful panelists here to get any further insights that we can include. So if you've registered for this event, we will follow up and try to answer as many of them as we can. So I appreciate that. This has been a really, really good discussion. I'm so happy with all the things that we've been able to touch on today. We are at our last minute here. So if I could grab some final takeaways from each of you, your last kind of words of wisdom, so to speak, for people who are either just embarking on this journey for their organization, what are your kind of like main takeaways that you would provide them with so they can go away feeling motivated as they get started and not overwhelmed or overburdened?
Yeah, I'll just jump in. And actually, it's reinforcing what we've said, but diversity is a business imperative. And within life sciences, I think we need diversity of backgrounds and thinking and cultures of inclusion to really deliver the innovation and business performance for our patients and our customers. So it's a business imperative.
I would jump in. So it's a learning journey for all of us. Nobody knows everything, so we can be creative and try to learn. And one thing, check out Pfizer's website. You look for this program, Breakthrough Fellowship. You will see we don't have enough people of color at professional level. So we're going to sponsor students to come intern, then we send them back to school. They get their advanced degrees, they come back to work. It's a new program, but that's how we get creative to get to where we need to.
Yeah, I would, a couple of things that I would say is, it's hard work, it's fulfilling work, but it's not ever going to be one and done, right? So it's a journey that you're going to be on for a long haul. And I would also say it can take an emotional toll. So make sure you're also taking care of you as you're going through the journey, and make sure you have a good solid network of people that outside your organization, inside your organization, but your own kind of personal advisory board that you can work with and learn from. And Queenie, I liked what you said. I have a saying that I always keep running through the back of my mind, which is, am I learning or am I defending, right? And I just keep repeating that mantra to myself. So those are some things I would say.
I would just say, talk to your leaders, talk to your employees. They will tell you what's important to them. You don't have to start with everything. You just need to start with a couple of things, and you can build on that as you go. But you will be amazed at how much expertise already exists in your organization. People have volunteered to do all sorts of different things and bring their own experiences in, and that can be really, really valuable. So, start small. Every little bit matters.
I would say don't do diversity just for the sake of doing diversity. Make sure that it matters. Make sure it's tied to a purpose. Make sure that it's meaningful and it can make meaningful, positive, impactful change.
Thanks so much, everyone. We're right at time. We will send out follow-up communications, including some resources from BioSpace, that we've talked about, including our most recent reports in our diversity and life science series. Thank you so much to our panelists. I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.